Michael and Laura had been married for over 10 years. To anyone on the outside, they were the ideal couple, devoted, loving, and successful. Michael, a software engineer, often joked that Laura, a clinical psychologist, was the real genius in the family. She had a calming presence and an effortless way of making people feel understood, a quality that made her popular with both her colleagues and patients. But beneath that perfect exterior, there were cracks that Michael had started to notice, small, almost imperceptible things that set off an uneasy feeling deep inside him. It started with the odd hours. Laura began coming home later and later, always with a plausible excuse, an emergency session with a patient, or a new psychological study she was conducting. Michael, trusting and often absorbed in his own work, didn't question it at first. But then there were the phone calls she would take in the middle of the night, speaking in hushed tones as if she didn't want him to hear. He dismissed it as professional confidentiality. After all, she was a therapist. She had to maintain privacy. One evening, Laura announced that she'd be working late again. Michael nodded, trying to ignore the unease growing in his chest. But after she'd left, he found himself unable to focus on anything else. There was something off about her behavior, something he couldn't put his finger on. Acting on impulse, he decided to drive by her office just to reassure himself. When he arrived, the building was completely dark. His pulse quickened as he circled the parking lot, looking for her car. It wasn't there. Michael's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she was at a colleague's office or meeting a patient elsewhere. He tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. He left a brief message, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hey, just checking in. Call me when you can." Hours passed, and still no word. Michael sat in their living room, staring at his phone, fighting the rising tide of anxiety. When she finally came home, it was well past midnight. Her hair was disheveled and she looked flushed, almost excited. "Sorry I'm late," she said, avoiding his gaze. There was an unexpected situation. Michael forced a smile. "No worries, everything okay?" Laura hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Yes, just a bit of a crisis with a patient. Nothing I can't handle." Michael didn't push her further, but that night, as she slept beside him, he felt a chasm opening up between them. He started noticing more things after that: the faint smell of cologne on her clothes, the mysterious texts she'd delete almost immediately, and the way she seemed more distant, more preoccupied. It wasn't just that she was hiding something, it was like she had become a stranger. Unable to ignore his suspicions any longer, Michael decided to take matters into his own hands. He installed a small tracking app on her phone, a step that made him feel sick with guilt. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The first few days were uneventful. Laura's location matched up with where she said she'd be: her office, the grocery store, the gym. But on the fourth day, things changed. Laura told him she'd be working late again. Michael watched as the tracker showed her leaving her office and driving to a secluded neighborhood on the other side of town. She parked at an abandoned-looking warehouse. Michael's heart pounded as he stared at the blinking dot on the map, his mind racing with possibilities. He had to see for himself. He drove there, the streets empty and dark. When he arrived, he parked a few blocks away and approached the warehouse on foot. The building loomed in front of him, its windows boarded up. But through a crack in one of the windows, Michael could see a faint light flickering inside. He moved closer, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through the crack. What he saw made his blood run cold. Laura stood in the middle of the warehouse, her back to him. In front of her was a man, bound to a chair, his face pale and frightened. Laura was speaking softly to him, almost soothingly, but there was a cruel edge to her voice. Michael's body went numb as he watched, unable to process what he was seeing. Laura, his Laura, leaned in close, whispering something in the man's ear that Michael couldn't hear. Then she turned and picked up a small gleaming object from a table beside her. Michael felt like he was in a nightmare, his mind struggling to understand. She's just helping him, he told himself. It's some form of therapy, it has to be. But as Laura continued speaking, her posture calm and composed, Michael realized with a growing sense of horror that whatever she was doing, it wasn't to help the man in front of her. What the hell is she doing? Who is that man? Michael knew he should leave, call the police, do something. But he couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the horror unfolding before him. Laura stepped back, her face calm as she watched the man's terrified expression. She leaned in close again, whispering something else, then gently patted his cheek. And then she did something that made Michael's heart nearly stop. She reached out and stroked the man's hair, her eyes soft, as if she were comforting him. But the man's panicked gaze said it all. Whatever was happening, he didn't want to be there. Michael turned and ran, his mind a whirl of disbelief and terror. He drove home in a daze, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the car on the road. When he got back, he went straight to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake off the chilling vision of what he had just seen. How could this be real? How could she be capable of something like that? Michael spent the next few days in a fog of confusion and denial. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. His mind was a constant loop of questions and what-ifs. He told himself that what he saw wasn't real, that he had misinterpreted the scene, that there had to be some logical explanation. But the images refused to leave him. Laura's calm expression, the fear in the man's eyes, the way she seemed to take pleasure in his discomfort. He knew he needed answers. He needed to confront her, but every time he tried to bring it up, his words would die in his throat. Laura seemed more relaxed than she had been in months, smiling more, talking more, even going out of her way to make dinner and spend time with him. She acted like everything was normal, as if she hadn't just been in an abandoned warehouse with a stranger. Finally, one evening, as they sat down to dinner, Michael couldn't hold back any longer. "Laura," he said softly, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. "Where were you the other night?" She looked up, blinking in surprise. "What do you mean?" "When you said you were working late," he pressed, his gaze searching her face for any sign of deception. I went by your office, and you weren't there. You were somewhere else, a warehouse, in a part of town you never go to." Laura's fork paused midway to her mouth. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Michael saw something flicker across her face, something cold and calculating. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a sweet, understanding smile. "Oh, Michael," she said gently, setting down her fork. "I should have told you. It's part of a new study I'm conducting. I've been working with a few subjects who have severe phobias. We're using exposure therapy in controlled environments to help them overcome their fears." "Exposure therapy," Michael echoed, his heart pounding. "In an abandoned warehouse?" Laura shrugged casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "It's a secure location, and it allows us to create scenarios that would be difficult to replicate in a clinical setting. I'm sorry I didn't tell you before. I just didn't want you to worry." "But that man," Michael whispered, leaning forward. He looked terrified, like he didn't want to be there. Laura's smile tightened ever so slightly. Of course he was scared. That's the point of exposure therapy, to face your fears head on. It's not supposed to be pleasant, but it's effective. And I'm always there to make sure nothing goes wrong. Michael's gaze remained locked on her, searching her eyes for any sign of a lie. But she held his gaze steadily, her expression calm and sincere. Could it really be that simple? Could he have misunderstood everything? He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked softly, his voice betraying his lingering doubt. Laura sighed, reaching across the table to take his hand in hers. "Because I know how much you worry about me, Michael. And I didn't want to add to your stress. I thought I could handle it on my own." Her thumb brushed gently over his knuckles, a familiar, comforting gesture. "I'm sorry if I scared you, but I promise everything's fine. You have nothing to worry about." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to just let it go and pretend everything was okay. But something inside him wouldn't let him. Can I see IIT?" he asked hesitantly. "Your research, I mean. The file's a study, anything that shows what you've been doing. Laura's smile faltered. For a split second, he saw a flicker of irritation flash across her face, but she recovered quickly, her expression softening. "Of course," she said quietly. "I'll show you everything. But not tonight, okay? I didn't bring the files home, and it's all confidential data. I'll bring it to you this weekend, and we'll go over it together. Would that make you feel better?" Michael nodded slowly, relief mixing with the lingering unease in his chest. Yeah, that would help." Laura squeezed his hand gently. "I love you, Michael. I'm not hiding anything from you. I just want to help these people, and I want you to trust me." He forced a smile, nodding again. "I love you too." But as they finished dinner and Laura cleared the plates, a nagging doubt continued to eat away at him. Something still didn't add up. He needed more than just her words. He needed proof. That weekend, Laura brought home a thick folder filled with neatly typed notes, charts, and psychological reports. She sat beside him on the couch, carefully explaining each document, each step of the study. Michael listened intently, his eyes scanning the papers for anything that seemed out of place. "This is where I've been conducting the sessions," Laura said, pointing to a series of photos showing the interior of the warehouse. It looked clean, organized, almost like a real clinic. The photos showed various rooms set up with equipment, chairs, and even a makeshift waiting area. "And these are the consent forms," she continued, pulling out several signed documents. Each subject agreed to participate fully, even if it meant experiencing high levels of discomfort. They all understood the risks. Michael's gaze lingered on the signatures at the bottom of each form. Everything seemed to be in order. No red flags, no missing pieces, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Why didn't you just do this in your office?" he asked quietly. "Wouldn't it have been easier?" Laura sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I needed more space, and I didn't want to bring that kind of energy into my practice. It's important to keep the sessions separate from my regular work, for the safety and comfort of everyone involved." Michael nodded slowly, feeling his resolve start to crumble. It all made sense. She had an answer for everything. But as he glanced at the last page of the report, something caught his eye, a small note scribbled in the corner in Laura's handwriting. "Subject becoming increasingly agitated. May need to transfer to a new facility if condition worsens." "Who's this about?" he asked, pointing to the note. Laura glanced at it, then shrugged lightly. "Just one of the patients who's been having a harder time adjusting. Nothing to worry about. We've already made arrangements to continue treatment elsewhere." Michael frowned. "And where's that?" Laura's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Somewhere safer, Michael. Somewhere more suitable." His heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" But before Laura could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing. "I have to take this," she murmured, standing up and walking toward the kitchen. Michael watched her go, his mind spinning. He glanced back down at the folder, his gaze lingering on the note. Somewhere more suitable. What did that mean? A thought crossed his mind, a dangerous, desperate thought. He needed to know more. He needed to find out who these people were, what she was really doing. When Laura stepped into the kitchen, he slipped his phone out of his pocket and quickly took photos of the documents. He would look into it later, when she wasn't around. Laura returned a few minutes later, her expression apologetic. "Sorry about that. Emergency with one of my patients. I need to head out for a bit." "Everything okay?" Michael asked, forcing his voice to sound casual. "Yeah, just a minor issue," she said with a soft smile. "I'll be back soon. Don't wait up, okay?" Michael nodded, watching as she grabbed her coat and left the house. The moment the door closed behind her, he grabbed his phone and opened the photos. He scanned the documents quickly, his fingers trembling as he searched for anything that would give him a clue about where to start. And then he saw it, a name, buried deep within the patient notes. Ethan Carter. His heart raced as he typed the name into a search engine, his mind whirling with anticipation. What he found made his blood run cold. Ethan Carter was missing. He'd been reported missing weeks ago, around the same time Laura's study had begun. His family had been pleading for information, offering rewards, begging anyone with knowledge to come forward. Michael stared at the screen, his body numb. Laura hadn't just been treating him, she had been hiding him. Michael's entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He sat there staring at Ethan Carter's photo on his phone, the words "missing person" flashing in bold letters beneath his smiling face. Every fiber of his being screamed that this wasn't a coincidence. Ethan wasn't just another patient. He was a victim, someone Laura had taken under the guise of treatment. But why? What was she doing with him, and how many others were there? Michael's mind raced as he scrolled through the missing person reports, each one a haunting reminder of the man he saw in the warehouse. He found at least 3 more names, all men, all reported missing within the last few months. Each disappearance coincided with the dates Laura had claimed she was working late or conducting sessions. Each of them vanished without a trace. A chill ran down his spine as he realized just how deep this went. Laura wasn't just treating these men, she was targeting them. But for what purpose? What was she doing with them behind those closed doors? He had to know. He couldn't just sit here while she continued whatever twisted game she was playing. He needed proof, something undeniable that would expose her for who she really was. Grabbing his coat, Michael hurried out of the house. He drove straight to the warehouse, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. It was late, the city shrouded in darkness, but he barely noticed the passing streets. His focus was singular: get to the warehouse, find the truth, and end this nightmare once and for all. He parked a few blocks away just like before and approached the building with cautious steps. The warehouse loomed before him, its broken windows and crumbling facade casting long, eerie shadows under the streetlights. Taking a deep breath, he crept around the side of the building and found the same crack in the window he had peered through the first time. It was dark inside, but as his eyes adjusted, he noticed a faint light coming from deeper within the warehouse. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Laura was here. She had to be. Heart pounding, he made his way around the building, carefully avoiding any noises that might give him away. He found an unlocked door and slipped inside, his breath catching as the cool, stale air of the warehouse enveloped him. He moved slowly, inching his way down a long corridor, his footsteps barely a whisper on the concrete floor. As he neared the source of the light, voices floated to him, low and murmuring. He paused, straining to hear, his pulse racing. "You're doing so well," Laura's voice cooed softly. "Just a little more, and we'll be done for tonight." There was a low groan of pain, followed by a quiet whimper. Michael felt a surge of panic. He couldn't just stand here and listen. He had to see. Edging closer, he peered around the corner. His breath hitched at the sight before him. The room was set up like some sort of medical facility. Bright lights illuminated a single chair in the center, where a man sat slumped over, his wrists bound to the armrests with thick straps. He looked disoriented, his head lolling to the side as if he were struggling to stay conscious. Laura stood beside him, her expression calm and focused. She held a syringe in one hand, gently tapping the needle. She leaned down, her voice a soft murmur as she whispered something to the man. Michael's body went cold. What was she injecting him with? Before he could think, before he could plan, his body moved on its own. He burst into the room, his voice a raw shout of rage and desperation. "Laura, stop." Laura's head snapped up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Michael," she breathed, straightening slowly. "What are you doing here?" "Let him go," Michael demanded, his hands shaking as he took a step closer. "I know what you're doing, Laura. I know who this is." Her gaze flickered with something dark, anger, maybe, or something more dangerous. But then she smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Michael," she murmured, her tone almost gentle, "you don't understand. This isn't what you think." "Isn't it?" he spat, glancing at the man in the chair. "Ethan Carter, he's missing, Laura. and he's not the only one. Laura's smile didn't waver. She set the syringe down on a nearby tray and took a step toward Michael, her eyes never leaving his. "They're not missing," she said softly. "They're here, with me. I'm helping them, Michael. I'm giving them what they need." "What they need?" Michael's voice broke. "You're hurting them, Laura. I'm saving them," she interrupted sharply, her expression turning fierce. "These men, they were broken, lost. They needed someone to show them the way, someone to help them become more than what they were." Michael stared at her, his mind reeling. "What are you talking about? Don't you see?" she whispered, her gaze almost pleading. "I'm fixing them, Michael. I'm making them better, stronger, just like I made you better." His stomach churned. "What are you talking about?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, hypnotic murmur. "You were lost once too, Michael, remember? You felt weak, powerless, but then you found me. I showed you what you were capable of. I made you see your true potential." "No," he breathed, shaking his head. "No, Laura, you twisted everything. I unleashed you," she interjected, her voice a mixture of fervor and conviction. "You were shackled by your own limitations, by your fear. And now, you're doing the same thing, denying who you are, denying what we are." Michael's throat tightened, a knot of dread and confusion constricting his chest. "We're not the same. I'm not like you." Laura's smile softened, almost pitying. "You keep telling yourself that, but deep down you know it's a lie. You've already crossed the line, Michael. That night, in the garage with that man, you felt it, the power, the control. You tasted what it's like to be free." "No, Michael's voice faltered. He wanted to argue, to scream that she was wrong, but his words died in his throat. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as memories he'd tried to bury surged to the surface, his hands shaking as he held the knife, the rush of adrenaline, the thrill of having someone else's life in his hands. Laura took another step closer, her gaze boring into him. "It felt good, didn't it? Just for a moment you weren't afraid. You were in control." Michael shook his head violently, stumbling back. "Stop it, Laura. Just stop. You don't have to hide anymore," she whispered, her voice almost gentle. "You don't have to pretend. We can be together, like we were meant to be, you and me. We could be unstoppable." He stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, a fleeting, terrifying moment, he almost believed her. Almost wanted to take her hand, to follow her into whatever dark abyss she was offering. But then his gaze shifted to Ethan, still slumped in the chair, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. This wasn't power. This wasn't control. This was torture, manipulation, evil. And if he gave in now, if he let her twist him any further, he would be lost forever. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, Laura, I won't do this. I won't let you drag me down with you." Her expression darkened, the softness melting away to reveal a hard, unyielding resolve. "You think you have a choice?" She spat, her tone laced with scorn. "You're already mine, Michael. You've always been mine." "No," he repeated, louder this time. "You don't control me." Laura's eyes flashed with fury. "You can't walk away from this, from us. If you do, I'll make sure you regret it." Michael took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing himself to stand tall. "You're right about one thing, Laura. I did cross a line that night, and I've been running from it ever since." She tilted her head, her gaze narrowing suspiciously. "What are you saying?" He took a step forward, his jaw set. "I'm saying I'm done hiding. I'm not running anymore. But I'm not joining you either." A low, mocking laugh escaped her lips. "And what are you going to do? Call the police? Turn me in? They'll never believe you, Michael. I'll make sure of it." "I know," he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers. "But I'm not alone." Before she could respond, the door behind him burst open. Several men in tactical gear stormed into the room, weapons drawn. Laura spun around, her eyes widening in shock. "Freeze," one of the officers shouted. "Hands in the air, now." Michael stepped back, his chest heaving as the officers advanced on Laura. She looked around wildly, her gaze darting between Michael and the men surrounding her. You called Tem," she whispered, disbelief etched across her face. Michael nodded, his expression grim. "I took photos of your notes. I found Ethan's family. I told them everything, and they told the police." Laura's face contorted with rage. "You think this is over? You think turning me in will end this?" She snarled, her voice shaking with fury. "You have no idea what you've done." One of the officers moved forward, securing her hands behind her back with cuffs. She twisted, struggling against their grip, her gaze burning with hatred as she locked eyes with Michael. "You'll pay for this, Michael," she spat. "You'll pay for betraying me." He swallowed hard, his heart aching with a strange mixture of guilt and relief. "I'm sorry, Laura," he murmured, "but this has to end." Her gaze softened just for a moment, a glimmer of something almost like sadness flashing in her eyes. "It never ends, Michael," she whispered softly as the officers began to drag her away. "You and me. It'll never be over." She was pulled through the door, her voice fading into the distance, leaving Michael alone in the room with the wreckage of what used to be their lives. He took a shuddering breath, glancing around at the sterile lights in the empty chair where Ethan had sat. It was over. She was gone. But as he stood there, the silence pressing in around him, a gnawing sense of dread began to creep back in. What if she was right? What if it wasn't over? What if? No matter what he did, she would always be a part of him. He pushed the thoughts away, shaking his head. No, he couldn't let her words poison his mind any longer. She was in custody now. She couldn't hurt anyone else. With a heavy heart, Michael turned and walked out of the warehouse, the night air cool and crisp against his skin. He looked up at the sky, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the storm raging inside him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. But freedom, he realized, came with its own kind of chains. The things Laura had said, the darkness she had brought out in him, they weren't something he could just erase. He would have to live with it, fight it, every single day. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real price of escaping her. Months passed, and life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Michael moved to a new city, changed his number, started a new job. He tried to rebuild, piece by piece, putting distance between himself and everything that had happened. But no matter how far he ran, shadows of the past seemed to follow him. He still dreamed of her, Laura's voice calling to him from the darkness, her smile haunting his every step. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the memory of her words echoing in his mind. "You'll never be free of me." He tried therapy, medication, anything that might silence her lingering presence in his head. But nothing worked. It was like she had left a mark on him, an invisible scar that refused to heal. One evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment staring blankly at the TV, his phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, his heart leaping into his throat. It was an unknown number. Hands trembling, he picked up the phone, hesitating for a long moment before answering. "Hello," he whispered, his voice barely audible. There was a pause, then a soft, familiar chuckle. "Hello, Michael." His blood ran cold. It couldn't be. She was locked away. She was. "Miss me?" Laura's voice purred through the line, smooth and seductive. Michael's heart pounded violently in his chest. How did you?" "Oh, don't worry, love," she murmured, her tone dripping with amusement. "I'm not coming for you. Not yet. I just wanted to remind you that I'm still here." "Laura, stop this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're supposed to be." "In a cell?" She finished for him, her laugh low and dangerous. "Maybe, maybe not. But wherever I am, you'll never be rid of me. Because I'm part of you, Michael, and I always will be." He squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, you're lying. You're not real. You're not." "I'm as real as you want me to be," she whispered softly. And you know what, Michael? I think you want me to be very, very real." The line went dead. Michael sat there, his body shaking, his mind spiraling into darkness. She was gone. She was supposed to be gone, but no matter how far he ran, no matter what he did, he couldn't escape her. And deep down, in the deepest, darkest corners of his soul, he knew he never would. Michael spent the rest of the night sitting on his couch, his mind trapped in a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and anger. He stared at his phone, half expecting it to ring again, Laura's voice to seep through the speaker like a ghost whispering from the shadows. But the phone stayed silent, leaving only the echo of her last words. He tried to convince himself it was a prank. Someone who knew about the case, someone who had found out his new number, trying to mess with him. But no matter how many times he repeated it, he couldn't shake the feeling that Laura had somehow reached out to him, that she was closer than he thought. The following morning, exhausted and on edge, Michael called the prison where Laura was being held. He demanded to speak with someone in charge, his voice strained and tense as he explained the situation. "She called me," he insisted, gripping the phone tightly. "I don't know how, but she called me last night." There was a pause on the other end, then a polite, measured response. "Mr. Donovan, I can assure you that it's impossible. Mrs. Donovan has been under strict surveillance since her incarceration. She has no access to phones or any other means of communication." Michael's pulse quickened. "But I heard her voice. Are you telling me I imagined it?" "I understand your concern, Mr. Donovan," the officer replied calmly. "But we have protocols in place. If you'd like, we can arrange for you to speak with her supervisor, and they can provide you with more details about her situation." "Fine," Michael muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just make sure she's where she's supposed to be." "Please." "We will, sir. Thank you for your call." He hung up, a gnawing sense of unease twisting his gut. What if they were wrong? What if Laura really had found a way to reach him? Days passed, and nothing happened. No more calls, no strange packages, no mysterious messages. Michael started to think, hope, that maybe it had all been a mistake, a cruel trick of his own mind. But then, late one night, just as he was starting to drift off to sleep, the phone buzzed again. He bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. He fumbled for the phone, his fingers trembling as he looked at the screen. Another unknown number. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to answer. "Hello?" There was no response, just silence. "Laura?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "If it's you, just say something." Still nothing, just the faint crackle of static on the other end. "Please, Laura," he pleaded, tears stinging his eyes. "Just tell me what you want." And then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, there was a quiet click, followed by a single, faint beep. The line went dead. Michael stared at the phone, his skin crawling. What was that? It didn't sound like Laura. It didn't sound like anything. But the next morning, when he checked his voicemail, there was a new message. One he hadn't noticed before. With shaking hands, he pressed play. A soft hum filled the speaker, a rhythmic, steady beeping sound. Then a woman's voice, low and smooth, whispering two words. "Look outside." Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned his head to the window. The blinds were drawn, but he could see the faint outline of someone standing on the other side. His entire body went rigid with fear. He stayed perfectly still, his gaze locked on the shadow beyond the blinds. It was late morning, bright daylight, and yet a deep chill settled over him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He glanced down at his phone, then back at the window. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stay away, to call the police, to do anything but look. But he couldn't stop himself. Slowly he stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked toward the window. His heart pounded louder and louder as he reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the blinds back just an inch. The figure outside shifted slightly, a face coming into focus through the narrow gap. Michael's blood ran cold. It was a woman, a young woman, with long dark hair and pale skin. But it wasn't Laura. The features were different, sharper, the eyes darker. She stood perfectly still, staring straight at him with an unnervingly calm expression. "Who are you?" Michael whispered, his breath fogging up the glass. The woman didn't respond. She simply raised one hand, pressed her finger to her lips in a gesture of silence, then turned and walked away. Michael watched her go, his heart pounding erratically. He rushed to the front door, flinging it open and looking around wildly. But she was gone. No car, no footsteps, no sign of where she'd gone. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. "Laura." He breathed, his mind spinning. "What are you doing?" He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. He knew Laura had connections, people who were loyal to her even after her arrest. Was this one of them? Someone she'd sent to mess with him, to make him doubt his own sanity? He spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, every movement outside the window. He checked and rechecked the locks on his doors, his hands shaking with paranoia. That night, when the phone buzzed again, he didn't hesitate. He answered immediately, his voice a low, desperate growl. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no response, just that same soft, rhythmic beeping sound. But this time, the message was clearer. A voice, Laura's voice, filtered through the static. "Tick-tock, Michael. Time's running out." The line went dead. Michael stared at the phone, his body trembling uncontrollably. What did she mean? Time for what? Was she trying to break him? Drive him to the brink of madness? He had to know. He had to find out what she was planning. The next morning he drove to the prison. He didn't care about appointments or protocols. He needed to see her, to look her in the eyes and demand answers. The guards tried to turn him away, but his insistence and desperate demeanor convinced them to let him through. He was led down a long corridor, his heart hammering in his chest, his pulse a frantic rhythm that matched the beeping sound he'd heard on the calls. And then, finally, he was face to face with her. Laura sat on the other side of the thick glass partition, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as he entered, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "Michael," she purred, leaning forward slightly. "I wasn't expecting you." He dropped into the chair, his body tense, his gaze locked on hers. "What are you doing, Laura? How are you doing this?" She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Doing what, love? Don't play games with me," he growled, his voice tight with rage and fear. "The phone calls, the woman outside my window. What is this?" Laura's eyes sparkled with amusement. "You really think I'm behind all that? Michael, I'm in here. I don't have access to any of those things." "Then who?" he demanded, his fists clenched. "Who's helping you?" She leaned back, her smile fading to something softer, almost regretful. "No one's helping me, Michael. Everything that's happening, it's all you." His brow furrowed in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You're doing this to yourself," she murmured, her gaze piercing. "The calls, the woman, it's all in your head, because you're not as free as you think you are." Michael shook his head violently, his body trembling. No, you're lying. You're trying to mess with Mum." "Am I?" she asked softly. "Or is it your guilt, your fear? Maybe you're just starting to realize the truth." "What truth?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Laura's smile was gentle, almost pitying. "That you and I will never be apart. I'll always be with you, Michael. In here." She tapped her temple lightly. "You'll never escape me, because you don't want to." "Shut up," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Shut up." Laura's smile didn't waver. "You'll see, love. You'll see that I'm right." The guard stepped forward, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Time's up, sir. You need to leave." Michael stumbled to his feet, his mind spinning, Laura's words echoing in his ears. You don't want to escape." He glanced back at her one last time as they led him away. She sat there, watching him with that same calm, knowing smile. And for the first time, he felt a cold, horrifying truth settle into his bones. Maybe she was right. Maybe a part of him didn't want to let her go. Maybe he never would. Weeks passed and the calls continued. The mysterious woman outside his window appeared again and again, always watching, never speaking. He'd see her in crowds, on the street, just for a moment, before she vanished. Michael's sanity began to unravel, his days and nights blending into a haze of anxiety and paranoia. He hardly slept, barely ate, and avoided leaving his apartment whenever he could. He became a prisoner in his own mind, trapped by the haunting echoes of Laura's voice and the shadowy figure that seemed to follow him everywhere. Every time his phone rang, he jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He knew what would be waiting for him on the other end. Either that rhythmic beeping or Laura's voice, taunting him, reminding him that no matter what he did, he'd never truly be free. He tried changing his number, getting a new phone, even moving apartments again. But each time the calls resumed within days. It was like she had some invisible thread binding them together, one that couldn't be severed no matter how hard he tried. One night, after another sleepless stretch of staring at the ceiling and listening for any sign of movement outside, Michael snapped. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number of the prison where Laura was being held. He demanded to speak with the warden, his voice a frantic, desperate plea. "She's getting to me," he whispered hoarsely. "She's messing with my life. You need to stop her." There was a long pause on the other end, and then the warden's calm, authoritative voice responded. "Mr. Donovan, we've reviewed our records multiple times since you last called. Mrs. Donovan has had no contact with the outside world. There's simply no way she could be doing this." "You're wrong," Michael shouted, his fingers clenching around the phone. "She's doing something. She has people working for her, or she's found a way. You have to believe me." "Mr. Donovan," the warden said patiently, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but I assure you, your wife is under strict surveillance. There's no evidence that she's involved in any of the incidents you've described." Michael's head spun, anger and fear warring for dominance. Then what the hell am I supposed to do? Just sit here and let her drive me insane? "I suggest you seek professional help, sir," the warden replied softly. "Sometimes the mind can play tricks on us after intense emotional trauma. I recommend speaking to a therapist who can help you work through what you're experiencing." "Help me work through?" Michael choked on a bitter laugh. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" "I didn't say that, Mr. Donovan," the warden said gently. "But please, consider speaking to someone. It might help you find some peace." Michael ended the call without another word, his hands shaking with frustration. They thought he was losing it, that he was just another victim of psychological damage, hallucinating, imagining things that weren't real. But they were wrong. He knew they were wrong. The next few weeks were a blur. Michael isolated himself completely, cutting off what little contact he had left with the outside world. He disconnected his phone, boarded up his windows, and spent his days pacing his apartment, going over every detail of his life, searching for clues, connections, anything that would explain what was happening. He started keeping a journal, documenting every phone call, every sighting of the mysterious woman, every dream where Laura's voice whispered in his ear. The pages filled quickly, his handwriting becoming more erratic and desperate as the entries piled up. One night, after what felt like hours of staring blankly at the walls, Michael made a decision. If no one else would believe him, if no one else would help him, he'd have to find the truth on his own. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for any information he could find on Laura's old associates, people she'd worked with, friends she'd had before her arrest. He scoured forums, news articles, social media, anything that might lead him to someone who could shed light on what she was doing. It didn't take long to find the first connection. A man named Victor Hargrove, a psychiatrist who had once been a close colleague of Laura's. He had defended her during the trial, arguing that she was misunderstood, that her methods were unconventional but ultimately meant to help. He'd gone off the radar after Laura's conviction, resigning from his position and disappearing from the public eye. Michael stared at the screen, his mind racing. If anyone knew what Laura was up to, it would be Victor. He had to talk to him, had to find out if he was somehow involved in the calls, the strange appearances, the endless torment that was consuming Michael's life. He tracked down an old address for Victor, an isolated house in a rural area, far from the city. Without hesitating, Michael grabbed his keys and headed out. The drive was long, the roads winding and empty, but he barely noticed. He was driven by a single purpose, to find answers, no matter what it took. When he finally arrived, the house loomed before him, dark and silent. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. Michael hesitated for a moment, then stepped out of the car and made his way to the front door. He knocked, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. For a long moment there was no response. He knocked again, harder this time. "Victor?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "It's Michael Donovan. I need to talk to you." There was a creak from somewhere inside the house, and then a faint shuffling sound. Michael's pulse quickened. He took a step back as the door slowly swung open, revealing a tall, gaunt man standing in the shadows. Victor Hargrove looked nothing like the polished, confident psychiatrist Michael remembered from the trial. His hair was unkempt, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes were bloodshot and hollow. "Michael Donovan," Victor murmured, his voice raspy. "I never thought I'd see you again." Michael swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "I need your help, Victor. It's about Laura." Victor's expression tightened, a flicker of something like fear crossing his face. "Laura, she's in prison, Michael. She can't. She's getting to me." Michael interrupted, his voice trembling. "I don't know how, but she's calling me, sending people to watch me. It's like she's everywhere. And I need to know how she's doing it." Victor stared at him for a long moment, then stepped back, gesturing for Michael to come inside. "You'd better come in. There are things you need to know, things I didn't tell anyone." Michael followed him inside, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The house was dimly lit, cluttered with papers and books stacked haphazardly on every surface. It felt more like a bunker than a home, a place where someone was hiding rather than living. Victor led him to a small, cluttered living room and motioned for him to sit. He sank into a worn armchair across from Michael, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a half-empty glass of whiskey from the coffee table and took a long, shaky sip. "What you're experiencing is not unusual," Victor said quietly, his gaze distant. "Laura was always persuasive. She had a way of getting into people's heads, making them believe things that weren't real." Michael frowned, leaning forward. "What are you saying, that this is all in my head?" Victor shook his head slowly. "No, I'm saying that Laura, she's different. She has the ability to influence people, to make them see things, hear things, even feel things that aren't really there. It's more than just psychology, it's something deeper, something darker." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying she's supernatural or something?" Victor let out a bitter laugh. "No, nothing like that. But there's a part of her that can latch onto others, that can stay with them even when she's gone. I've seen it before, patients she treated who kept seeing her, hearing her voice, long after she left. They couldn't escape her, no matter what they did." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. "So you're saying I'll never be free of her?" "I'm saying," Victor murmured, his eyes meeting Michael's with a haunted look, "that she's not going to stop. Not until she's finished with you." Michael's stomach twisted. "Finished with me? What do you mean?" Victor took another long sip of whiskey, his gaze dark and unreadable. "Laura doesn't let go, Michael. She'll push and push until she breaks you, or until she's satisfied." A sense of dread settled over Michael like a suffocating fog. "So what am I supposed to do?" Victor leaned back, his voice a low, tired murmur. You have two choices. You can keep running, keep fighting, but you'll never win. Or you can give her what she wants. And what does she want? Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Victor's lips curved into a sad, knowing smile. You. Michael felt the air leave his lungs, the room spinning around him. He stared at Victor, a deep, primal fear clawing at his insides. Then how do I stop her? He breathed, desperation lacing his words. Victor's smile faded, his gaze turning somber. The only way to stop Laura is to make her believe she's won. Michael's blood turned to ice. You mean give in? Not entirely, Victor said softly. But you have to make her think you're on her side, play along. Make her believe that she still has control over you. It's the only way to get close enough to end it. End it? Michael echoed, his voice trembling. How? Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. You have to confront her, face to face. But not like before, not as a victim, not as someone trying to escape. You have to show her that you've accepted her reality, that you've given in. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. And then what? Victor glanced around the room, his expression grim. You find her weakness. You break her from within. It won't be easy and it won't be quick. But if you can convince her that you've surrendered, she'll let her guard down. And that's when you strike. Michael shook his head, his body trembling. But she's in prison, how am I supposed to? She won't be there forever, Victor interrupted, his gaze intense. People like Laura, they always find a way out, and when she does, she'll come for you. She'll want to draw you back into her world to see if she can still manipulate you. Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. So, you're saying I should just wait, let her come to Mem? Yes, Victor said quietly. Wait, and when she reaches out again, don't resist. Don't push her away. Let her think you're broken, that you've finally accepted your place beside her. Only then will you be able to get close enough to destroy her hold on you. And what if I can't do it? Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. What if she gets to me again? Victor's eyes were dark and hollow, filled with a sadness that made Michael's skin prickle. Then she'll consume you, just like she has so many others. And this time, there won't be any escape. The drive back to his apartment was a blur of conflicting emotions, fear, determination, dread. Victor's words echoed in his mind, each syllable weighted with a grim finality that made his stomach twist. Wait for her, play along, pretend you've given in. Could he really do that? Could he let Laura back into his life, even if it was just an act? As much as he hated to admit it, Victor was right. Running hadn't worked. Fighting hadn't worked, and if he wanted to put an end to this nightmare, he needed to face Laura head on. But the thought of letting her get that close again, of pretending to be under her control, it made his skin crawl. He remembered the way she'd looked at him during their last meeting, that knowing smile, those words that seemed to burrow into his mind and take root. You don't want to escape. He had to hold on to his resolve. He had to remember why he was doing this, to end it, once and for all. When he reached his apartment, he found himself hesitating at the door. The building felt different now, darker, heavier, as if Laura's presence had seeped into the very walls, waiting to envelop him the moment he stepped inside. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped in. The silence was suffocating. Every shadow seemed to shift and pulse at the edge of his vision, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a taunt. He set his keys down on the table and took a few cautious steps forward, his gaze darting around the empty room. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign of the woman who'd been watching him, no new messages or strange packages. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He wandered through the apartment, checking each room, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. By the time he reached the bedroom, his nerves were frayed, his body on the verge of collapse, and that's when he saw it. Sitting neatly on his pillow was a single white envelope. Michael froze, his eyes locked on the envelope. His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone broken in? How had they known where to place it, what it would mean? Slowly, he stepped forward and picked up the envelope. His name was written on the front in elegant, familiar handwriting. Laura's handwriting. With trembling fingers, he tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Hello, love." The words seemed to leap off the page, wrapping around his mind like a vice. "I'm glad to see you're still listening. I know it's been hard, but I need you to trust me. I need you to remember that no matter what happens, I'm doing this for us. There's so much more for us to accomplish together, so many people we can help. All you have to do is accept it. Accept me." Michael's breath hitched as he continued reading. "I know you've been feeling lost, but that's okay. I'll find you again, just like I always do. And when I do, we'll start over, better, stronger, without any more lies. I've missed you, Michael. I've missed us. But soon, this will all be behind us. See you soon, love. Keep your phone on. With all my heart. Laura." Michael's hand shook violently as he stared at the note. His mind screamed at him to tear it to pieces, to throw it away, but he couldn't move. Her words seemed to pulse in his head, each sentence a reminder of how deeply she had sunk her claws into him. "Keep your phone on." He dropped the letter and stumbled back, his chest tightening. She was coming for him. Victor had been right, she wouldn't stop. Not until she had him back under her control, back in her world. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had no choice. If he wanted to end this, he had to play along. He had to let her think he was giving in. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Michael picked up his phone and turned it back on. No messages, no missed calls. But he knew it wouldn't be long. The days that followed were a test of endurance and willpower. Michael went about his life as if everything were normal, pretending to ignore the subtle signs that Laura was still watching. He kept his phone on him at all times, waiting, anticipating. And then, one evening, as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, his phone buzzed. His heart leapt into his throat. He picked it up, his hands trembling, unknown number. With a deep breath, he answered, "Hello." "Hello, Michael." Laura's voice purred softly through the line. "It's good to hear your voice again." He swallowed hard, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Laura, Shh," she whispered, her tone soothing. "I know you've been scared. I know you've been running, but it's okay now. I'm not angry. I just want to talk." Michael forced himself to take a slow, steady breath. "I'm tired of running, Laura. I'm tired of everything." There was a pause, then a soft, pleased hum. "I know, love. I know. But I need you to trust me. I'm doing this for us, for your own good." He closed his eyes, his chest tight. "What do you want me to do?" "Just one thing," she murmured. "I need you to come see me. Not at the prison. There's a place, a safe place. A place where we can talk without anyone listening." His pulse pounded in his ears. "Where?" "I'll send you the address," she said softly. "Come tonight and we'll figure this out. Together." Michael hesitated, his mind screaming at him to say no, to hang up, to call the police. But instead, he forced out a single shaky word. "Okay." Laura's voice was warm and satisfied. "Good boy. I knew you'd come around." The line went dead, leaving Michael staring blankly at the screen. A moment later, a text appeared with a single location. His hand shook as he read it, his entire body trembling with fear and anticipation. He knew it was a trap. He knew she was planning something. But this was his chance, his only chance, to end it for good. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Michael grabbed his keys and headed out the door. The drive to the address Laura had sent him felt like a descent into darkness. The city lights faded into the distance as he took back roads and narrow winding streets, the trees closing in around him like twisted, skeletal hands. When he finally arrived, he found himself in front of an old, dilapidated building, an abandoned mental institution, its windows boarded up, its once white walls now gray and crumbling. A shiver ran down his spine. This was the place the place where Laura wanted to meet. He stepped out of the car, his breath misting in the cold night air, and made his way to the front door. It creaked open before he could even touch it. Michael's heart pounded wildly as he stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The darkness enveloped Michael as he stepped inside the abandoned building. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the empty corridors, adding to the eerie stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. His footsteps were slow and tentative as he made his way deeper into the building. He moved with caution, his senses on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming that he shouldn't be here. But he had no choice. This was his only opportunity to end things, once and for all. "Laura," he called out softly, his voice trembling in the silence. "I'm here." There was no answer, just the empty, hollow sound of his own voice bouncing off the walls. He swallowed hard and took another step forward. His eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, and he strained to see any sign of movement, any hint that he wasn't alone. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a faint glow coming from one of the rooms down the hallway. Heart racing, he turned and walked toward the light. It grew brighter as he approached, spilling out through the cracked door like a ghostly beacon. He hesitated just outside the doorway, his hand hovering over the doorframe. "Laura?" he called again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Come in, Michael," her voice murmured from within, soft and inviting. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, making everything look distorted and surreal. And there, in the center of the room, was Laura. She stood with her back to him, dressed in a simple black dress that seemed to blend into the shadows around her. Her hair, longer than he remembered, cascaded down her back in soft waves. She turned slowly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips as her gaze met his. "Hello, Michael," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange mix of warmth and amusement. "I knew you'd come." Michael's throat tightened. What is this place?" She gestured around the room with a casual wave of her hand. "Just a little meeting spot, somewhere private where we can talk without anyone interrupting." He took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been following me, watching me." "Of course I have," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "I had to make sure you were ready, that you weren't going to run again." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't understand. How are you doing this? You're supposed to be in prison." Laura's smile widened. "Do you really think I'd let myself be trapped like that? I have friends, Michael. Powerful friends who owe me favors. It took time, patience, and a little persuasion, but here I am, free, just like I always knew I'd be." Michael's heart sank. "So you've been out this whole time?" She shook her head. "Not the whole time, but long enough. Long enough to set things in motion. Long enough to make sure you'd come back to me." He took another step closer, his body tense with a mixture of fear and anger. "Why, Laura? Why go through all of this? Why not just leave me alone?" Her expression softened, and she took a slow step toward him, closing the distance between them. "Because I care about you, Michael. You're special. You always have been, and I want to help you realize your true potential." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "My true potential? You mean turning me into a monster like you?" Laura's eyes flashed with something dark and dangerous, but her smile remained. "You're not a monster, Michael. You're just incomplete. You've been denying who you really are for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be free." "Free?" he spat, his voice shaking. "You think this is freedom? Stalking me, driving me insane, making me doubt everything I see and hear. That's not freedom, Laura. That's torture." She sighed softly, shaking her head. "You're still not seeing the bigger picture. Everything I've done, everything I've put you through was for a purpose. To break you down so I could build you back up, stronger, better. without the chains of fear and doubt holding you back. Michael stared at her, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. You broke me, all right. You broke me into pieces. And now, I don't even know who I am anymore. That's where you're wrong, she murmured, reaching out to gently touch his cheek. He flinched at the contact, but she didn't pull back. You know exactly who you are, Michael. You've just been afraid to accept it. He stepped back, his skin crawling at her touch. And what if I don't want to accept it? What if I don't want to be like you? Laura's gaze darkened, and for the first time, her smile faded. You don't have a choice. You've already started down this path. There's no going back. Michael shook his head furiously. No. I can still fight this. I can still. You're not listening, she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing with intensity. You've been fighting this whole time, and look where it's gotten you. Lost, alone, scared of your own shadow. But if you'd just embrace it, if you'd let go of this ridiculous notion of right and wrong, you'd see what I see. You'd see what you're capable of. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking. And what's that? Greatness, she whispered, her voice low and fervent. Power. Control. You have it in you, Michael. I've seen it. I've felt it. All you have to do is stop resisting. Stop pretending to be something you're not. Michael stared at her, his heart pounding wildly. For a split second he felt the pull of her words, the seductive lure of the freedom she promised. A life without fear, without doubt. A life where he could be anything, do anything. But then he remembered Victor's warning, the look in Ethan's eyes, the horror of what he'd almost become. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, Laura, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to be your puppet. Her expression twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. You're so stubborn, Michael, so damn stubborn. She stepped back, her gaze never leaving his. But that's okay. I've been patient this long. I can wait a little longer. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice tight. Laura smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down his spine. I'll let you go for now, but I promise you, Michael, you'll come back. You'll come back because you won't be able to stay away. I'll be in your thoughts, in your dreams. Every time you close your eyes, every time you think you've escaped me, I'll be there, whispering in your ear, reminding you of what you truly are. Michael shook his head furiously, taking another step back. You can't control me anymore, Laura. I'm done being your pawn. Laura chuckled softly, the sound low and almost pitying. Oh, Michael, I don't have to control you. I never did. You were always the one who came back. Always the one who wanted to understand, who wanted to know why. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing through him. Do you think you're really here just to end this? To confront me and be free? She took a slow step forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Or are you here because some part of you wants this? Michael clenched his teeth, his hands trembling. No, that's not true. I'm here because you can't live without me, she finished for him, her smile widening. Because I'm in your blood, in your very soul. And deep down, you know that no one will ever understand you the way I do. Stop it, he muttered, his voice breaking. Just stop. You want to be free of she continued, her voice relentless. Then why do you keep chasing me? Why do you keep coming back to the same questions, the same doubts? Why do you keep letting me in? Michael's breath came in ragged gasps. He wanted to argue, to scream that she was wrong, but her words slithered into his mind, twisting and turning until he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and hers began. You want to be free? Laura whispered, leaning in close, her breath warm against his cheek. Then prove it. With a sudden fluid motion, she reached into her dress and pulled out a small, gleaming object, a knife, the blade shining faintly in the dim light. Prove that you're strong enough, she murmured, holding the knife out to him, her gaze locked on his. Prove that you can end this, once and for all. Michael stared at the blade, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. His vision swam, the room seeming to warp and twist around him. He knew what she was asking him to do, knew exactly what she wanted. "Take it," she whispered, her voice soft, seductive. "All you have to do is take it. One little cut, one little move, and it's over. No more fear, no more doubt. Just peace." He reached out, his hand hovering over the knife. His fingers twitched, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and terror. He could feel her presence, feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on him, urging him forward. "Do it, Michael," she murmured, her eyes shining with a strange, hungry light. "Show me that you're not afraid. Show me that you're strong enough to face the truth." His hand moved closer, his fingertips brushing against the cold metal of the blade. For a moment, just a moment, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He could do it. He could end this nightmare, end the pain and the fear. All it would take was one swift movement, one act of finality. But then he heard it, a voice, faint and distant, echoing in the back of his mind. "Don't do it, Michael. Don't give in." He froze, his fingers hovering over the knife. The voice was familiar, comforting. It cut through the haze of Laura's influence, grounding him, pulling him back from the brink. "Remember why you're here. Remember who you are." He blinked, his vision clearing. He looked down at the knife, at the way it gleamed under the flickering light, and then back at Laura's face. She was watching him intently, her expression tense, her smile faltering ever so slightly. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "No, Laura, I'm not doing this." Her eyes narrowed. "What?" He took a step back, his hand falling to his side. "I'm not playing your game anymore. I'm not going to let you control me." A flicker of frustration crossed her face. "Michael, I'm done," he said louder this time, his voice firm. "I'm done letting you twist everything, letting you make me doubt myself. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Something dark and dangerous flashed in her eyes, and she took a step closer, her expression hardening. "You think you can just walk away? You think you can just leave me?" "Yes," he whispered, taking another step back. "Yes, I do." For a moment they stared at each other, the air crackling with tension. And then, slowly, Laura's lips curved into a cruel, mocking smile. "Fine," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Go then, run. But don't think this is over, Michael. Don't think I'm just going to let you walk away." She lowered the knife, her smile widening. "You'll come back. You always come back. And when you do, I'll be waiting." Michael's heart pounded wildly in his chest, but he forced himself to turn away. He didn't look back as he walked to the door, his hands trembling, his mind screaming at him to run, to get as far away from her as possible. He stepped out into the cold night air, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The building loomed behind him, dark and oppressive, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, his footsteps quick and uneven as he made his way back to his car. As he drove away, the darkness closing in around him, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He'd done it. He'd faced her, resisted her pull. For the first time in what felt like forever, he'd chosen to walk away. But as the adrenaline began to fade, doubts crept in. Had he really won, or had he just played right into her hands? What if she was right? What if he'd never truly be free of her? The question swirled in his mind, refusing to let him rest. He glanced down at his phone, still clutched tightly in his hand. And then, as if on cue, the screen lit up. Unknown number. Michael's breath hitched. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He knew it was her. Knew that if he answered, he'd be pulled right back into her web. But he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he pressed the button and lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello?" There was a soft chuckle on the other end, a low, familiar sound that sent shivers down his spine. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Laura whispered, her voice dripping with amusement. Michael closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion crashing over him. "Goodbye, Laura," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Until next time, love," she murmured, her tone light and mocking. "You'll come back. You always do." He ended the call and dropped the phone onto the seat beside him, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was over. He'd made his choice. He wasn't going back. But even as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. No matter how far he ran, no matter what he did, a part of him would always be bound to her. And somewhere deep in the shadows of his mind, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a strange limbo. Michael moved through his life as if he were underwater, every action slow and heavy, every thought weighed down by the lingering presence of Laura. He tried to focus on work, tried to reconnect with his old friends, even took up new hobbies in an effort to keep his mind occupied. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the sense of being watched, of being pulled back toward the darkness he'd left behind. Every creak of the floorboards in his apartment made his heart race. Every shadow flickering at the edge of his vision felt like a warning. The phone calls had stopped, but silence had its own weight, a crushing, suffocating presence that made him feel even more isolated, more vulnerable. It wasn't until a few weeks later that things took a turn. One morning, as Michael was getting ready for work, he found another letter slipped under his door. It was folded neatly, almost casually, and his name was scrawled across the front in that same familiar handwriting. His heart sank as he picked it up. He knew he shouldn't read it, knew that whatever was inside would only drag him deeper into the web he was trying so hard to escape. But he couldn't stop himself. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the letter. "Dear Michael, I knew you wouldn't stay away. I could feel it even as you walked out of that building. There's a part of you that will always belong to me, and I'm so glad you're finally starting to understand that. I've been patient, letting you have your little rebellion, your moment of defiance, but you and I both know that it won't last. Sooner or later, you'll come back. And when you do, I'll be waiting. Love, Laura." Michael's chest tightened, his vision blurring as he stared down at the words. How had she found him? He'd moved to a different part of town, taken every precaution to stay off her radar. And yet, she'd still managed to reach him. A cold sense of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. If she could find him here, what else could she do? He glanced around the apartment, a fresh wave of paranoia washing over him. Had she been here? Had she slipped in while he was out, watched him as he slept? He needed to do something.